I have another story from old Ireland. A story that was probably written down, it was nearly 1,000 years ago. But when it was written down, it was an old and famous story even then. Now, I've already told you a story about one of the many kings of Ireland back then. They had their problems, those kings. They had to be good kings. They had to do all the right things. And at the same time, they had to be rich, give great parties, and be good looking as well. They also had to listen to their storyteller poets, because those storyteller poets, they knew a thing or two. And they were so important. They could even cause a king to lose his throne. I told you a story about Athenya, the poet who wouldn't share. But I haven't yet told you a story about some of the superhero warriors who flock these stories and make them so special. Now, these warriors were really important. They weren't just soldiers, they were more like elite athletes. You know, when you see the Winter Olympics and the snowboarders who can move on ice and do somersaults off walls and all sorts of things. Well, they were more like that. Only they didn't work on ice, no, they worked on chariots. They used to be able to leap on and off their chariots while they were going along. They could do wonderful feats like leap over the tips of their spears, maybe just bouncing on the top before they came down again. They were wonderful athletes and great fighters too, if I have to admit that. And there are so many stories about them. In fact, they are so famous, and the storyteller poets told their stories and praised those warriors so much that some of those stories we still know today. And they're so famous that I'm pretty sure that if I told you one or two of the most famous warriors' names, you'd recognise them. Have you not heard of Cuchulainn? I'm sure you have. But I'm not going to tell you a story about Cuchulainn today, maybe another day. Have you heard the name of Fionn Maol? I thought you might. He was said to be one of the greatest superhero warriors of all the stories of Ireland. And stories gathered around him like moths in moonlight. He was said to be the wisest man in Ireland, the strongest man, the bravest man, the cleverest man. But I'll tell you a story about him today, him and some of his friends. Now let me introduce them. Fionn Maol had a band of elite hero warriors around him. They were known as the Fianna. Now, if you'd wanted to join the Fianna, it wasn't so easy. And who wouldn't want to join the Fianna? First of all, can you guess what you had to be really, really expert and good at? You think fighting? Hunting, maybe? No, what you had to be really, really good at was poetry. Now, that's surprising, and I'll tell you why later. But it was true. You had to be good at fighting and you had to be good at hunting. And if you wanted to join the Fianna, they'd have some tests for you. One of the tests was they'd stand you in a big hole in the ground, up to your waist, and then they'd blindfold you. And then the rest of the Fianna would attack you with sticks and staves and spears, and you'd have to fend off their attacks, even though you were in a pit and blindfolded. And that's not easy to do. I think Luke Skywalker had to go at something like that when he was being trained by Yoda, but this is a much older story. And then if you got through that test, and the test of poetry, a third test was they'd take away your shoes, so you were barefoot, and they'd tie up your hair, because hair was worn long in those days, into very tight plaits, and then they'd send you racing through the forest, as if you were the deer, the prey. And then they'd hunt behind you, and if they so much as heard one twig crack beneath your feet, or one branch break from a tree, or if when you got back, one piece of hair was loose from the tight plait, then you weren't good enough to join the Fianna. Oh no, you had to be really good. So my story today is about the Fianna and some of Finn's friends. But as I said, Fionn was the wisest, bravest, strongest, most amazing hero in the whole of Ireland. But this story, well, it really isn't about Fionn. So I better tell you about some of his friends. Now, one of his friends was called Gall MacMorna. Now, Gall was a giant of a man with a terrible temper and red hair to match. But he's not really the hero of our story either. I wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of Gall. Now, another of Finn's friends was called Diarmuid. Now, Diarmuid was a very good-looking young man. In fact, when he was hardly more than a boy, he'd been followed by one of the fairy women, one of the women of the Sidhe. and they nearly captured him and took him away into that other world from which people never come back, or at least not this week, next week, maybe 300 years' time. He had a very near escape, but just before he got away, one of the women of the Sidhe just managed to touch his forehead, and it left a mark. And after that, any woman who saw Diarmuid would go, "Oh, Diarmuid," and fall at his feet in a swoon. Well, that was great the first time. It was quite amusing. He even liked it the second time, but eventually it got boring having women falling down in front of him telling him how beautiful he was, so he kept the mark covered. But the story's not really about Diarmuid. Now, another of Finn's friends was called Conan. Now, I better tell you about Conan. He loved to be called Conan the Magnificent. But if Conan was here in the room with me, I'd ask him to put his hands over his ears. Because the truth was, Conan was really, really greedy. And really, really fat. And if he sat down at the table, he would eat every scrap on the table. Why, he would even eat the plates. Though the plates in those days were usually made of pieces of bread, so I suppose that was okay. But he would never leave a crumb behind or a drop in a cup. And so he was known behind his back, hands over his ears, as Conan the Greedy, Conan the Fat, Conan the Magnificent. Now, the other thing about Conan was that he was completely, absolutely bald. Now, that's not funny. We wouldn't laugh at somebody who was bald nowadays. Of course we wouldn't. But back then, when everybody had lots of long hair, they thought it was very funny. Hands over your ears, Conan. And they go, Conan the Greedy, Conan the Fat, baldy, baldy, baldy. No, sorry, Conan the Magnificent. That's what we should call him. And this story is about him. Now, one day, our four heroes, Fionn, Goll, Diarmuid, and Conan, decided that they would go hunting. They decided that most days. So they took their spears, and maybe they took their hunting horns. I don't know whether I can blow this one. That's not bad. And their bows and arrows, and they set off into the forest. Now, being good heroes, they followed every path they found. And while they were following paths they knew, that was good. But being heroes, they followed paths they didn't know. And when you follow paths you don't know, you find yourself lost. So now we have 4 lost heroes. Well, that was fine too, because they were heroes and they didn't mind being lost. But then something else happened that they didn't like. It started to rain. Now, back then, it was the men who had all the fancy hairstyles, and they liked to wear their hair all spiked up with lime and looking like hedgehogs that had been caught out in a frost. And the one thing they didn't want to do was get their hair wet. Well, except for Conan, who was bald and didn't care. So they looked for somewhere to shelter. And just then they came out into a clearing, and in the clearing they found the most beautiful house. It was one of those lovely round houses. I showed you a picture in an earlier story. And it had a roof of thatch that nearly went down to the ground, and the thatch shone in the glistening rain as if it had been made of gold. Well, they looked for the door. Now, usually with these wonderful, beautiful king's roundhouses, a palace in its day, there was usually a gatekeeper, a doorkeeper, who told you whether you could come in or whether you weren't important enough and had to go away. But there was no doorkeeper. And when they pushed the great leather door aside and looked indoors, there was nobody there. The roundhouse was completely empty. Well, they looked around, but the one thing there was, in the centre of the roundhouse was a great table, and the table was piled with food. Now, Diarmuid and Fionn and Goll, they didn't sit straight down at the table. They were heroes, and they did what heroes do. They looked around to see what was there. And it was Fionn who noticed that the wonderful doorway with its carved lintels was very finely made. This was certainly a king's doom. And it was Goll who looked up and saw the roof trees and the timbers. It must have taken 100 oxen to pull every one into place. This was certainly a king's doom. And Diarmuid, he noticed the finely woven, weaving wall hangings, all in colours of green and blue and soft pinks. This was a wonderful king's doom. But all Conan saw was the table piled with high, and soon he was sitting at the table, stuffing food into his mouth. Well, the other heroes took their share of the food, keeping one hand to their food and one hand to their swords, and one eye to the room around them and one eye to their plates, except for Goll, who I forgot to tell you only had one eye. But as for Conan, all he did was continue to push food into his mouth, fine meats, good cheese, fresh bread, good red wine, beer. Oh, it was a wonderful feast. Now, after a while, it was Diarmuid who noticed that something was wrong. Those woven hangings that had looked so bright with soft colours and fine patterns. Surely now they were looking grey, dull, as if they'd been woven together with cobwebs and bits of dead moss. No, this wasn't right. Something was wrong. It was Goll who noticed that those high, straight, finely cut roof timbers were coming lower and lower and were becoming gnarled and twisty, as if they were nothing but old tree roots dripping with dust. But it was Fionn who noticed the doorway, and it was no longer a rectangle of carved wood. Now it was round and looked smaller, as if it was no more than the entrance to a badger's set. And he knew what was wrong. "We're under enchantment," he cried. "This is no king's palace. We are lost in a hollow hill. We will be taken into the other world and trapped here. We must get out straight away." And they took out their swords and they began to fight their way out, cutting away at the tree roots, crawling out on their hands and legs, until they found themselves once more out in the lightful world. And when they turned round, there was no king's palace behind them. There was just a hollow hill covered in grey mossy stones and soft turfs, and the doorway was round and small and dark. But even heroes can count. 3, 1, 2, 1, 4, 3. There was somebody missing. Goll was there, and Diarmuid was there, and Fionn himself knew he was there outside in the sunlight. But where was Conan? Well, they looked inside the tiny little hole, the dark entrance back into the hollow hill. And there they saw Conan, still sitting at the table, still stuffing his mouth with food as if he was enjoying every bite. But what he was eating was not soft cheeses and fresh bread and good roast pig and drinking beer or wine. No, what he was eating were juicy, live, wriggling worms, slimy slugs, crunchy snails, and what he was drinking was muddy, mossy water. He was under an enchantment. He was trapped in the other world where he would never return. Unless they went and got him, and that's what they did, for they were heroes after all, and heroes will never leave a man behind. So once again, taking their swords, they cut their way in and squeezed and crawled until they were once again inside the hollow hill. They went up to Conan and they called his name. They waved their hands in front of his faces, but still he was under enchantment. Still he was in a trance. Once again they waved their hands. They shook his shoulders, and suddenly he woke up. And he saw that he was just about to put a piece of particularly tasty cheese into his mouth. And there he looked. And it was a wriggling, slimy worm. Ah! But when he tried to get up to his feet and leave, he found himself stuck to the seat on which he was sitting. His back and bottom couldn't move. Well, Fionn and his friends, they weren't going to leave him behind, and they flexed their hero's muscles, and they pulled, and they pulled, and they pulled, but they couldn't pull him free. "Let's have one more try," said Fionn. "We will not leave him behind." And all the time, the entrance to the lightful world was shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. One last time, they pulled at Conan. He was free, and all 4 heroes crawled on their bellies outside until finally all 4 were standing in the lightful world. And when they turned round, the entrance to the otherworld hill had gone completely. One of you has offended someone again, said Finn. Dermot, is it you, Dermot, who's trying to be taken? Was that the woman of the she trying to take you back into the lightful world? It's your fault. Oh, no, it isn't, said Dermot. I keep the mark on my head covered. It's not me. Well, they were still arguing when they heard a groan. As if someone was in terrible pain, and when they turned round, it was Conan. And now we get to the gory bit, for when they pulled him from his chair, he'd left the skin of his back behind, and oh, that was sore. Well, Finn was never one to leave a man in trouble, and so he looked for something to save his friend, to stop the pain, and his eye fell on an old sheepskin that was lying on the ground. He picked it up, and he clapped it onto Conan's back, just like that. And do you know, there it stuck, and there it grew. And never were the Fianna in want of woolly hats in winter, or woolly socks to keep their feet warm. If they wanted wool, all they had to do was shear the wool that grew on Conan Maol's back. Now, I think it turned out that he never quite forgave Dermot. He was quite convinced that it was Dermot's fault that he had got stuck in the other world, and that he was now growing sheep's wool on his back. Now, there are many superhero powers. Some superheroes can fly. Some can turn invisible. Some can shoot flames from their eyes. Some can throw fireballs. But Conan Maol is the only superhero I've ever heard of who grew wool on his back as his superpower. It's a good story, but I don't think that he ever forgave Dermot for nearly getting him trapped in the other world, and never again were Conan and Dermot such good friends. Now, it's a good story, and it's one of my favourites, and it's based on the story of the House of Quickentry, and there's several versions. But there's one thing that we haven't talked about. At the beginning, I said that to join the Fianna, the first thing you had to be really, really, really good at was poetry. And I think I know why. Because if you are a warrior and a poet, then you can write your own praise poems. You can tell everyone how brilliant you are. And remember, if you're a poet and you know the books of poetry, then everyone will believe what you say. And so maybe Finn was able to write poetry about his friends, and some of Finn's poetry has survived to this day, and you can still find it and you can still read it. But I think because he was a warrior and a poet, that's why we remember his name so well. There are many stories of Finn McCool, and maybe another day I'll tell you another one.